I'm in a place now where I feel strong, steady, and almost called to share this story. Maybe it's because I'm deeply fascinated by the woman at its center. Nicole Kidman, elegant, talented, and endlessly complex, has lived much of her life beneath the microscope of fame. For years, the world painted her as the perfect image of Hollywood grace. And when she married country music star Keith Urban, that illusion seemed complete. They were the golden couple, the love story everyone wanted to believe in. But perfection is a fragile thing. And for Nicole, the truth behind that perfection carried cracks, struggles, and moments of heartbreak that few ever saw before we can understand what really happened between Nicole and Keith. We have to go back to the very beginning of her story, long before the spotlight found her. Nicole's journey toward lasting love didn't start with fame, or even with Keith. It began decades earlier, shaped by the people who walked into her life and the choices that shaped her heart. In those early years, she learned that love could be beautiful, but it could also be fleeting. That being true to yourself sometimes means letting go of someone you care about. That the courage to love is often the same courage it takes to walk away. For Nicole, every chapter and every relationship, every heartbreak became a quiet teacher. These experiences didn't just shape her view of love. They built the foundation of who she would become. A woman strong enough to survive fame, heartbreak, and the endless gaze of the world. This story, her story, isn't just about glamour or red carpet moments. It's about what happens behind the curtain. It's about how one of the world's most admired women learned that love, no matter how dazzling it looks from the outside, can carry storms on the inside. And so, before we reach the headlines, the rumors and the heartbreak, we start where it all began, with a young woman learning how to love, lose, and still rise again. Long before Keith Urban entered her world, Nicole Kidman was already living inside a story that millions watched unfold on movie screens and magazine covers. It was the late 1980s, a time when she was still young, fearless, and chasing the dream of becoming an actress who mattered. She met Tom Cruise on the set of Days of Thunder. He was already a superstar, untouchable, magnetic. She was rising fast with that fiery mix of innocence and ambition that Hollywood loves to devour. When they fell in love, it wasn't quiet. It was sudden, consuming, cinematic, and the kind of romance that people write movies about. Tom saw in her a softness that grounded him, and Nicole saw in him a kind of power she thought might protect her. They became Hollywood royalty overnight, their lives shining under the world's brightest lights. But love that begins in a storm rarely ends in calm. Behind the cameras, behind the glamour, Nicole was learning the weight of being part of someone else's orbit. Tom was the world's biggest movie star, adored, guarded, and in many ways unreachable. Nicole, still growing into her own power, found herself trying to keep pace with a life that wasn't fully hers. She once said she didn't know who she was during those years. And it wasn't because she lacked confidence. It was because the world around her had already decided who she should be. Their marriage gave them two beautiful children, Isabella and Connor, and for a time, she believed they had built a forever. But forever has a way of breaking under pressure. When the end came in 2001, it came like a door slamming shut. Nicole described that period as one where she felt like she was falling apart. In the public eye, she smiled. In private, she shattered. It wasn't just the loss of love. It was the loss of identity. She had built her world around someone else, and now she had to learn how to live in her own again. But here's where Nicole's story begins to turn. Because from that heartbreak, from the ashes of a life that seemed perfect, and she began the journey of rediscovering herself, a woman no longer defined by who she loved but by what she had survived. After her marriage to Tom Cruise ended, Nicole Kidman found herself standing in a strange silence amid the kind that comes after thunder. For the first time in years, there were no flashing cameras outside her door, no scripts waiting to be read, no plans for the perfect family life, just stillness. And inside that stillness, pain. She once admitted she didn't know how to be alone. Her life had always been built around someone. Her parents, her career, her husband, her children. Now there was only her reflection staring back from the mirror, asking, who am I without them? But sometimes solitude is the beginning of healing. Nicole began to rebuild quietly. She threw herself into work not as an escape but as a kind of therapy. Her performances in The Hours and Moulin Rouge became mirrors of her own transformation. Women who broke, who endured, who rose again. It wasn't just acting anymore. It was survival through art. Her success returned stronger than ever. She won an Oscar, she earned respect. She proved that she was more than someone's wife. She was a force all her own. Yet even in triumph, there was an emptiness she couldn't fill. Fame could light up her name, but it couldn't warm her heart. In interviews, Nicole spoke about that period with a kind of softness. She said she prayed, and not for fame, not for another movie, but for peace. I wanted someone to share my life with, she said once. Someone kind, someone real. And life in its mysterious way answered her. In 2005, at an event in Los Angeles, Nicole met Keith Urban, a country singer from Australia who, like her, had traveled far from home to chase a dream. He wasn't wrapped in Hollywood shine. His world was music, authenticity, and a quiet kind of honesty that she hadn't felt in years. They spoke briefly that night, just a few polite words, but something lingered. It wasn't fireworks or fate written in lights. It was something gentler, something true. For the first time in a long while, Nicole felt the faint heartbeat of something new, not the rush of passion, but the calm of recognition, a love that might not be perfect but could finally be real. By the time Nicole Kidman met Keith Urban again, months after that first brief encounter, something inside her had shifted. She was no longer searching for the whirlwind kind of love that sweeps you away. She wanted peace and a partner who could stand beside her, not in front of her. Keith was unlike anyone she'd ever known. He carried a kind of quiet strength, a man who had wrestled with his own demons and still managed to smile with humility. His voice had the kind of warmth that made even pain sound like poetry. And his eyes, they carried understanding, the kind that doesn't need words. Their connection was slow, steady, real. Nicole once said that Keith made her feel safe for the first time in her life. They'd talk for hours about home, about art, about how fame can make people lose themselves. He didn't care about the Hollywood version of her, the red carpet goddess. He saw the woman beneath it all, a little shy, a little fragile, endlessly kind, and in his company, she began to breathe again. They fell in love quietly. There were no staged photos, no magazine covers, just two people learning to trust after years of noise. Keith wrote songs about her. She found inspiration in his music. Their worlds, film and country, seemed so different. Yet when they were together, it all blended into one soft harmony. In 2006, they married in Sydney under candlelight, surrounded by family, close friends, and the gentle hum of hope. Nicole wore a gown that looked like it belonged to another time. Pure, simple, almost spiritual. And when she looked at Keith that night, her eyes carried the light of a woman who had been through the storm and finally found the calm. But every love, no matter how beautiful, carries its own challenges. Keith was honest about his struggles, his history with addiction, his need to stay grounded in a world that often pulls people apart. Nicole, with all her strength, stood beside him not as a savior but as a partner. Their love wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. And for a while it felt unbreakable, two souls holding on, learning to heal each other's scars through music, patience, and faith. For a time, Nicole and Keith seemed untouchable, the kind of couple that made love look effortless. They appeared together at awards, smiled through interviews, and spoke about each other with tenderness. The world adored them, but behind the glow of fame and the flash of cameras, something fragile was quietly forming. Tiny cracks in the glass of their perfect life. Keith's world was music and loud, relentless, and filled with temptations. Touring meant long nights, distance, and the pressure of fame that had already cost him more than most knew. Nicole's world, on the other hand, was film, long shoots in distant cities, the emotional toll of losing herself in other people's stories. Their careers, though brilliant, began to pull them in opposite directions. Then came the breaking point. Just months after their wedding, Keith checked himself into rehab. To the public, it was a headline. To Nicole, it was heartbreak. She had stood beside him through his openness about his struggles, but facing them in real life was something else entirely. She later said that moment broke her heart, but also taught her what real love means. Instead of walking away, she chose to stay. She stood by him through recovery, quietly and fiercely without judgment. While others whispered, she built walls around their privacy, protecting what was left of their new life. Together, but the scars of addiction run deep. Recovery is never linear and fame never sleeps. The couple fought hard to find balance and to stay connected while the world demanded their constant attention. They welcomed 2 daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, and Nicole poured herself into motherhood with the same intensity she once gave to her art still. Even love as strong as theirs wasn't immune to fatigue. The road, the distance, the pressure, it all began to weigh on them. Friends close to the couple described them as deeply in love, but living on different frequencies. And through it all, Nicole kept doing what she'd always done. She smiled for the world and carried the pain in silence. Because when you've built a life on strength, sometimes the hardest thing is admitting when it's breaking. The cracks were small, invisible to most, but they were there, waiting, whispering, warning. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, or it comes from being unseen by the person who once knew you best. Nicole Kidman understood that feeling far too well. Years into her marriage with Keith Urban, life had given them everything people dream of: children, fame, beauty, success, and yet something invisible was slowly eroding the space between them. Keith's tour stretched across continents, his music echoing through arenas, while Nicole stood quietly at the edge of it all, balancing motherhood, acting, and the quiet ache of absence. She would often fly to join him, smiling for the cameras, her hand in his. But between them, conversations that once ran deep began to fade into small talk, the kind of words that fill space, not hearts. In private moments, Nicole tried to hold on. She believed in the vows they made, the love they built, the faith they once shared. But love, even the strongest kind, needs connection to breathe. And connection needs time. Something fame never gives freely. She once said, "When you love someone who's on the road, you never stop worrying that the distance will turn into a wall." And for them, it did. Keith, too, was struggling. The road was his escape and his curse. Music gave him purpose, but it also became the thing that took him away from the woman who anchored him. In interviews, he spoke about trying to keep love alive while chasing the dream. But behind that optimism, there was exhaustion, the kind that fame doesn't fix. Friends began to notice it. The silence between them during public appearances, the way their eyes met less often. Nicole, ever graceful, continued to protect their story, never letting the world see her pain. She had spent a lifetime mastering the art of appearing composed, even when her heart was quietly breaking. And then came the whispers, the kind that always follow celebrity love stories. Rumors of tension, of separation, of a woman growing tired of holding everything together. Nicole never confirmed them, but she didn't have to. Sometimes silence says everything. The world saw a power couple, but behind closed doors, 2 people were standing on opposite sides of a fading light, trying to find their way back to each other before it was too late. Every love story reaches a moment when pretending no longer works, when silence becomes heavier than the truth. For Nicole Kidman, that moment didn't arrive in a fight or a scandal or a single heartbreaking revelation. It came quietly in an ordinary morning, sunlight slipping through the curtains, her coffee growing cold as she realized something she had been trying to ignore for too long. She was tired of being the only one holding the story. Together, she had always been the woman who endured, the woman who stayed, the one who smiled through the storms, held her family close, and believed that love, real love, could survive anything. But the human heart has limits, even one as patient as hers. Keith was still out there, playing shows, writing songs, living in the rhythm of applause. Nicole admired him, always had, but admiration isn't the same as closeness. She longed for connection, for presence, for the quiet comfort of knowing that she was truly seen. And slowly she began to understand that the version of love she was fighting to protect no longer existed in the same way. She confided in a close friend that she felt like a ghost, walking through her own marriage, that even though she was surrounded by love, her daughters, her career, her friends, and something vital inside her had gone. Still, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to stop performing, not for cameras, not for fans, not for the fairy tale, just stop. And in that stillness, she began to hear her own Voice again, the voice. She'd lost somewhere between sacrifice and silence. Nicole turned to journaling, prayer, and long walks through her garden in Nashville. Those moments became her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe without pretending. Everything was okay, and as she faced her truth, a quiet kind of strength began to return, not the fierce public kind that wins awards or headlines, but the soft, steady strength that says, I can survive this too. It wasn't about giving up on love. It was about finally choosing herself. The decision didn't come in anger. It came in silence, and the same silence that had been growing between them for years. Nicole Kidman didn't slam a door or shout through tears. She simply reached a moment of clarity, a realization that love, no matter how deeply it's felt, can't survive if only one person is holding it up. She had fought for this marriage. Through rehab, through distance, through endless headlines and half-truths. She had defended it, protected it, and poured every ounce of herself into making it last. But love is not endurance alone, and it's also peace. And somewhere along the way, peace had slipped away. She once said that she felt like she was falling apart when her marriage began to unravel. Those words carried the weight of years spent smiling through pain, of suppressing her own needs to protect someone else's journey. And so, when she finally filed for divorce after 19 years of marriage, it wasn't out of bitterness, and it was out of exhaustion, and a quiet need to start breathing again. Keith was devastated. Despite everything, there was love. Deep, real, complicated love. But sometimes love isn't enough to heal what life has quietly broken. They had grown into different people, living in different emotional worlds, and neither knew how to bridge the gap anymore. Nicole didn't hold press, conferences, or make public statements. She let her silence speak for her. Her focus turned toward her daughters, her craft, her inner healing. For the first time in decades, she wasn't someone's wife or half of a power couple. She was just Nicole. And in that solitude, she rediscovered her own rhythm. She began writing again, walking barefoot through her garden, reconnecting with her faith. The pain was sharp, yes, but beneath it was a strange kind of freedom. The freedom of finally telling herself the truth. The world called it a breakup. For Nicole, it was a quiet resurrection, a painful but necessary step toward reclaiming the parts of herself she had given away, because sometimes love doesn't end with hatred. It ends with mercy. Mercy for the other person, and mercy for yourself. When the storm finally passed, Nicole Kidman didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't chase distraction, didn't dive into new love, didn't hide behind the next big film or red carpet. Instead, she did something rare. She allowed herself to pause. For so long, her life had been a series of performances, on screen, in love, in public. Now she was performing only for herself. The woman who once said she felt like she was falling apart began slowly putting the pieces back together, one small, deliberate act at a time. She focused on her daughters, Sunday and Faith, not just as a mother, but as a teacher of resilience. She wanted them to see that pain doesn't destroy you. It refines you. That endings, even the hardest ones, can become beginnings if you allow them to. In interviews that followed, Nicole spoke less about loss and more about growth. She said that getting older had taught her to stop chasing perfection and start embracing peace. Her words carried a new kind of wisdom, softer, grounded, and deeply human. She started spending more time away from Hollywood, on quiet countryside walks, in her Nashville home surrounded by music and memory. Friends described her as calm, almost luminous, as if she had finally stopped running from herself. She threw herself into meaningful projects, stories about strong women, stories about truth. Every role she chose from then on carried a piece of her healing. You could see it in her eyes, and that calm, that gravity, that mix of sorrow and grace that only comes from surviving something real. And slowly, the world began to see her differently too, not just as the actress or the ex-wife or the icon, but as a woman who had walked through the fire and come out softer, not smaller. In a quiet moment during an interview, when asked if she still believed in love, she smiled gently and said, "Of course, love is who we are. It's just that sometimes it asks us to let go so we can return to ourselves." It wasn't a story of loss anymore. It was a story of becoming.
In the quiet aftermath of everything, the fame, the heartbreak, the scrutiny, Nicole Kidman stood not as someone broken, but as someone reborn. Her journey through love, loss, and rediscovery had reshaped her into a woman no longer defined by what the world expected of her, but by what she had learned to expect of herself. For nearly 2 decades, her marriage to Keith Urban had seemed like a fairy tale written for the public eye. But behind the scenes, it had been a story of endurance, tenderness, and pain, a reminder that even great love can falter under the weight of life's complexities. When that chapter closed, she didn't seek pity or applause. She sought understanding. She spoke about it not as a tragedy, but as an evolution. Sometimes, she reflected in one interview, you don't lose love, it just changes shape. Those words lingered, echoing in the hearts of those who had watched her journey. It was clear that she no longer viewed separation as failure, but as a passage into a new kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. Her career flourished again, not in spite of her pain, but because of it. Every performance carried the depth of a woman who had lived every shade of emotion. She found joy in simplicity, her garden, her children's laughter, quiet nights filled with books and music. In a world obsessed with perfection, Nicole had become something more powerful, authentic. She reminded people that it's okay to fall apart, to begin again, and to redefine happiness on your own terms. Through her grace, she transformed her heartbreak into art, her silence into wisdom, and her past into purpose. She no longer needed the illusion of a perfect life. She had the truth. And that was more beautiful than any spotlight. And so, her story ends not with sorrow, but with peace, the kind of peace that comes when you stop running from pain and start listening to what it has to teach you. For Nicole Kidman, love was never lost. It simply evolved into strength, serenity, and the quiet light that still shines in her eyes today.